March 8, 1945. Outskirts of Aachen, Germany. Snow drifted through the dim morning light like falling ash, coating the devastated outskirts of Aachen in a pale, unforgiving blanket. Winter's grip had not loosened despite the war's advance. If anything, it seemed the cold had hardened in response to the chaos consuming the land. Houses once filled with the warmth of family voices now stood as silent skeletons, roofs broken open to the sky, windows shattered into jagged fangs of glass. Each ruined structure whispered its own story of artillery, retreat, and desperation. Through this desolate landscape moved 32 German female auxiliaries, communications clerks, signal operators, and medical orderlies torn from a Luftwaffe flak regiment that no longer existed. They walked without formation, without direction, without hope. Their regiment had been broken apart by an airstrike a week earlier, scattering personnel into the woods. In the confusion, the women became separated from officers' supply wagons and the main column. Since then, they had drifted through the forest like shadows, guided only by instinct and the persistent echo of distant gunfire. Please subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files to encourage us to bring you more powerful, untold World War II stories. Don't forget to like the video as well. Your support means everything. Their uniforms were no longer uniforms. Torn fabric clung to their skin like peeling bark. Fingertips protruded from ripped gloves, while coats that once offered warmth now held the cold rather than resisted it. Snow clung to their hair. Their boots, never built for marches this long, were soaked through and stiffening with ice. Hunger stalked them relentlessly. For 7 days, they survived on nothing but melted snow and whatever frozen roots they managed to scrape from the forest floor. Their stomachs cramped with emptiness. Their limbs shook from weakness. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But hunger wasn't the only thing driving them forward. Fear walked with them. Behind them circulated rumors whispered fiercely in the dark. Americans were taking female auxiliaries as priority targets. Some said they were sent to labor camps. Others said they were shot. Others claimed worse. Stories too terrible to repeat out loud. No one knew which rumors were truth and which were the inventions of terrified minds. In war, even lies became fuel for panic. The women did not know the Americans personally, only the stories that spread among retreating soldiers. What they feared most was the unknown. What waited ahead was uncertain. What waited behind them was worse. Marta Weber walked silently near the center of the group, a satchel pressed tightly under her coat. She was not the oldest nor the youngest, merely one of those faces that blended into the mass of worn, exhausted expressions. But there was a quiet sharpness in her eyes, a private awareness that set her apart. Others staggered blindly. She looked at the blackened treetops, at distant flashes of artillery across the horizon, at the way the wind carried strange echoes through the valley. She noticed everything. Even the weight of the satchel she carried seemed to root her thoughts in place, as if every step she took was chosen carefully, deliberately. No one asked what she kept in the bag. Curiosity had died the moment starvation took its place. The first collapse came on the second day when one of the younger auxiliaries fell face first into the snow, her weakened legs finally giving out beneath her. 2 women lifted her under the arms, dragging her along until she could walk again. On the third day, another fainted from dehydration. The others had no water to spare, only a handful of snow pressed into her mouth until she revived, trembling violently in their arms. On the 5th day, one woman screamed at the empty sky, sobbing that she could hear voices calling her name from the ruins. The others pulled her forward, terrified she would run into the trees and vanish forever. Their nerves were raw, stripped bare by cold, hunger, and the relentless pursuit of survival. Every sound became a threat. The crack of a frozen branch behind them sent several into panic. A distant artillery blast made others drop to their knees, covering their heads in fear. Even the whisper of wind through the trees sometimes made the group quicken their pace, convinced it was footsteps or worse, vehicles. On the 7th day, they reached a ravine where a bridge had once stood. Only the shattered remains of the structure remained, half submerged in frozen water. They climbed across the jagged beams one at a time, gripping rusted metal with shaking hands. Halfway across, a piece of debris groaned underweight, sending two women scrambling back in terror, screaming as the beam cracked but did not fall. When they finally reached the other side, several collapsed in the snow, too weak to continue. Marta alone remained standing, her satchel clutched tightly, her eyes scanning the treeline. She heard something the others didn't. Engines. Distant. Low. American? German? She couldn't tell. She only knew it meant movement, military movement. And movement meant danger. By the 8th morning, a pale, icy sun rose reluctantly above the forest. The women trudged forward, stumbling more than walking now. Their breath streamed in frozen bursts. Their shadows stretched long behind them as they entered a clearing. That was when they saw it. A farmhouse, ruined, burned, skeletal, yet still standing enough to offer shelter. One side of the roof had caved in. The door hung crooked, barely attached. The windows were shattered. Snow gathered in the corners like forgotten debris. But to them, it looked like salvation. No one questioned whether it was safe. Safe was no longer a concept they believed in. Shelter mattered more. Inside, it was warmer than the outside air, shielded from wind. Dust floated in beams of pale sunlight. A toppled chair lay against a cracked wall. A table, broken but still upright, sat in the far corner. One woman dropped to her knees immediately. Another leaned her head against the wall, eyes fluttering. A third began to cry softly, overwhelmed by exhaustion. None of them noticed the fresh boot prints near the doorframe, prints they themselves did not make. None of them heard the faint rustling outside, the sound of movement far too deliberate to be wind. None of them sensed the shift of shadows behind the cracked window pane. The moment their bodies finally surrendered to rest, the world shattered again. The door slammed open. Flashlights erupted, blinding and sudden. Boots thundered inside. Cold metal clicked as rifles came up in practice formation. American soldiers poured through the doorway in a burst of force and precision. The women froze. They did not scream. They did not run. They simply stood, as still as stone, as if fear had paralyzed every muscle in their bodies. American patrol. They were caught, trapped, surrounded. Lieutenant Daniel Whitford stepped forward, his rifle held low, but ready. His breath formed mist in the cold air. His eyes swept over the women. 32 figures of starvation, trembling, barely clinging to Kansai. Usness. What he saw was not a threat. What he saw was suffering. He lowered his weapon, and for the first time in 8 days, something shifted in the air, something the women did not expect. Compassion. Get them blankets, he said quietly. And food? Now. The women blinked, stunned. A medic stepped forward, draping a wool coat over the shoulders of one woman who looked young enough to still be in school. Another soldier placed a steaming pot on the broken table. Thick stew. Real food. The smell alone was enough to weaken knees. One woman collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. They had not eaten in a week. Before the rest of this story unfolds, please subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us share more forgotten World War II stories with the world. March 8, 1945. The ruined farmhouse near Aachen grew still again once the first wave of shock passed. The American soldiers kept their rifles at the ready. Their breaths came out in small white clouds that hung in the cold air before fading away. The light from their flashlights swept across the room, revealing the full weight of what they had walked into. 32 German female auxiliaries stood before them, gaunt, trembling, and half collapsed from starvation. They expected punishment. They expected rage. They expected every dark rumor soldiers had whispered throughout the collapsing German lines. What they received instead was something none of them understood at first. Kindness. Lieutenant Daniel Whitford stepped farther inside, boots crunching over broken glass. His face was rough from weeks on the move, lines etched deeper by exhaustion and the strain of the long winter campaign. Yet his eyes held a strange gentleness, something softened by the sight of suffering rather than hardened by it. He studied the women quietly. Their faces were hollow. Their fingers were stiff with cold. Some could barely stand without leaning on the wall. These were not the fierce enemy soldiers the division often encountered. These were worn-out clerks and medical orderlies who looked closer to collapse than to combat. Keep the rifles up, Whitford said softly, but ease the tone. He understood that fear could make even harmless people dangerous if cornered. He also understood the thin line between caution and cruelty. An American medic knelt beside one of the auxiliaries who sat shaking on the floor. Her name was Clara, though the Americans did not know it yet. She stared at the medic with wide, frightened eyes, unsure whether to flinch away or allow the stranger to examine her frostbitten hands. The medic slowly unwrapped a thick wool coat, placing it gently around her shoulders. Clara pulled it tighter, clutching it with trembling fingers, as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. Another soldier lifted the stew pot he had carried inside. He set it on the broken table and removed the lid. Steam rose upward in thick curls, carrying the smell of potatoes, beef, and onions. The aroma drifted through the room like a blessing. Several of the women began crying without sound, tears carving clean streaks down dirty, cold-stained faces. For one long moment, silence held the farmhouse. The Americans stared at the women. The women stared back, unmoving, unsure if the food was real or if it was some kind of cruel trick. Then one auxiliary, too weak to hold herself upright, fell to her knees. Her sobs broke the tension like brittle ice. She reached toward the pot, stopped halfway, then hesitated as if expecting a blow or a shouted order. Instead, one of the Americans stepped forward and steadied her arm. "It is all right," he said. "Eat." The women moved carefully, almost fearfully. They held out cups and dented metal bowls they had carried since leaving their regiment. The Americans filled each one with careful hands. The food shook inside the bowls as trembling fingers tried to hold them. The first mouthfuls were almost painful to swallow, their bodies unprepared for anything richer than snow. One auxiliary fainted after only 3 spoonfuls, her starved system overwhelmed. The medics rushed to bring her around again, checking her pulse and breathing while her companions whispered her name in panic. When she woke, she wept silently against her sleeve. The Americans watched. Some were moved, others were cautious. A few were confused. War had conditioned them to expect danger from the most unexpected places. Yet here in this ruined room, surrounded by exhausted enemy women, danger seemed like the least present thing. Whitford kept scanning the space, clearing shadows in the corners with his flashlight. He noted broken tiles, the sagging rafters, the old stove that still held traces of ash. Nothing about the room suggested an ambush. No hidden men. No fresh tracks beside their own. No weapons visible. Still, something about the scene unsettled him. Maybe it was the way one of the auxiliaries kept glancing at the woman in the middle of the group. A woman with dark hair and a calm expression that did not match the panic of the others. She held a worn leather satchel tightly against her chest, even while accepting food. She was quiet, too quiet. Her name was Marta Weber. While the other women cried or whispered in relief, Marta barely reacted. She ate slowly, deliberately, her eyes constantly following the soldiers as if measuring distances, calculating risks, or deciding whether to speak at all. Whitford noticed this from a doorway. "What is your story?" he wondered silently. "What are you carrying that the others are not?" He said nothing. Not yet. The patrol secured the perimeter. 2 men took positions outside, watching the woods for movement. The forest was dark and unnervingly quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. The front was shifting. The Americans had pushed through Aachen and were driving deeper into German territory. They expected counterattacks. They expected snipers. They expected sabotage supply lines. They did not expect starving female auxiliaries walking straight into their arms. Inside, the women slowly warmed by the fire the soldiers built in the old stove. A few auxiliaries removed their gloves to warm their hands over the flames. The skin was cracked and raw. Frostbite had started to claim fingertips. One girl wept as she watched the color return to her skin, as if she had forgotten what warmth felt like. Whitford spoke quietly to his sergeant. "We cannot leave them here. They will not survive the night." The sergeant nodded. "Command will not like it. They will say it slows us down." "Humanity cannot be paused for convenience," Whitford replied. He walked back toward the group. "You will come with us. We will bring you to a temporary holding camp. There will be doctors, food, warmth. The auxiliaries stiffened in fear. Some began crying again, but not from hunger this time. They remembered the rumors. Camps, interrogations, punishments. American custody was a mystery painted in the darkest shades imaginable. Whitford raised his hand slightly. You are not in danger. Not from us. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. Not the voice of a man expecting battle. The women listened, but did not fully believe. War had taught them caution, not trust. The Americans began organizing the group, handing out spare gloves, scarves, and coats from their packs. Every gesture was careful, patient, almost reverent. The auxiliaries accepted each item slowly, unsure whether to be grateful or frightened. Marta watched everything. Her satchel never left her grasp. Whitford nodded toward her. What about that one? His sergeant glanced over. Quiet. Watches everything. Hard to read. Quiet people often carry the most, Whitford murmured. For now, he let it go. The group prepared to move. The medics supported the weakest women. The soldiers formed a protective ring around the prisoners, rifles outward, watching for any sign of German patrols or stragglers who might try to interfere. The winter wind howled through the trees. Snow fell harder. The sky darkened. They stepped out of the farmhouse, leaving behind the broken table, the empty stew pot, and the warmth of the fire that had shielded them from the cold for a brief moment. The march toward the American lines began. The women followed quietly, their footsteps slow and uneven. Some leaned on the soldiers for support. Others kept their eyes on the ground, afraid to look at the unfamiliar world around them. Marta walked near the center, never loosening her grip on the satchel. She kept glancing toward distant hills, toward something only she seemed to know about. The Americans did not notice. Not yet, but they would, soon. March 8, 1945 continued to unfold with a strange mixture of silence and tension as the American patrol escorted the 32 German female auxiliaries away from the ruined farmhouse. Snow continued falling in slow, heavy flakes, muting the distant thunder of artillery. The landscape around them looked less like a battlefield and more like the remains of a broken world. Trees stood as black silhouettes against a gray sky. Smoke drifted from unseen ruins. The air tasted of ash and cold metal. The march was slow. Many of the women could barely lift their feet. The medics carried two, who had collapsed again shortly after leaving the farmhouse. The American soldiers walked with steady vigilance, rifles angled outward, scanning the tree for danger. Once in a while, they paused to listen. The woods had a way of changing tone without warning, as if something unseen was always shifting behind the bark and frozen undergrowth. No one spoke unless necessary. Yet even in the silence, something stirred beneath the surface. Marta Weber stayed near the center of the group, her satchel pressed tightly against her chest. Her eyes moved constantly, not with panic, but with a practiced awareness. She studied the trees, the soldiers, the path ahead. She walked as if she were counting paces, as if she knew something others did not. Whitford noticed. He did not confront her yet. He simply observed. By the time they reached the first ridge, the wind shifted. It carried with it the deep, rumbling growl of tanks. The American patrol halted. Whitford raised a fist for silence. The auxiliaries froze. Some began trembling again, memories of bombardments and scattered regiments rising sharply inside their minds. The rumble grew louder for a moment, then faded toward the west. American armor pushing forward. The patrol continued, helping the women over the ridge and down the other side. The snow grew deeper, slowing progress. The auxiliaries stumbled often, exhaustion weighing on their limbs like chains. Yet Marta did not stumble. Her steps remained firm, controlled, deliberate. She reached the bottom of the slope and paused for only a second, her hand tightening around the satchel. She looked ahead, as if measuring the exact moment to speak, but she stayed silent. At the base of the valley lay a narrow trail bordered by tall pine trees. The patrol moved into the passage cautiously. Whitford whispered for two scouts to push ahead. They disappeared down the trail without a sound. The rest of the group waited. Snow drifted down in slow curtains. The auxiliaries huddled together, shivering, afraid to separate even by a few inches. Minutes passed. Then the scouts returned. "Clear," one said quietly. "For now." Those 2 words were enough to keep the group moving. As the patrol progressed deeper into the valley, something subtle began to change. A tension formed in the air, not from the soldiers, but from the women. Several auxiliaries started glancing toward Marta the way frightened children look toward an older sibling who holds a secret. Their expressions tightened. Their eyes flicked nervously between her satchel and the soldiers walking alongside them. The Americans noticed none of this. Not yet. The march continued for another mile until they reached the remnants of an abandoned German outpost. Barricades half buried in snow. A storage shed collapsed inward. A tangle of rusted wire fencing. Whitford halted the group to allow the women a moment to rest. The medics checked pulses, examined frostbitten fingers, and redistributed blankets. The auxiliaries murmured weakly among themselves. All except Marta. She stood alone watching the sky. Then it happened. One of the American MPs noticed her satchel for the first time. "What is she holding?" he asked quietly. Whitford turned. He had wondered the same thing since the farmhouse. The satchel was thick, worn, and oddly heavy-looking. Far too heavy for personal belongings. Marta felt the tension shift toward her. She pulled the bag slightly closer, almost protectively. Whitford approached her slowly. He kept his voice calm. "I need to see what you are carrying." Marta hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of fear. Her eyes flicked toward the other women. Some looked away. Others looked terrified of what might happen next. Marta lowered her gaze to the snow, then held out the satchel with trembling hands. Whitford took it carefully and opened the flap. The moment he looked inside, the breath caught in his chest. Inside the bag lay a compact transmitter, small enough to be carried unnoticed, powerful enough to reach German units hidden in the hills. Alongside it was a stack of coded signal sheets, neatly folded, protected inside oiled paper. Whitford recognized the format instantly. German artillery fire missions. He lifted his eyes. The auxiliaries watched him with a mixture of dread and resignation. The American soldiers stiffened, rifles rising slightly. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind whistled through the broken fencing. Snow drifted into the satchel. Time seemed to slow, held captive by the weight of what had been uncovered. These women, whom they had fed and sheltered, had been carrying the very information that could have directed artillery on American positions. It could have meant the destruction of medical tents, supply lines, or even the patrol itself. Whitford stared at Marta. She stood completely still, her expression composed yet fragile. "Why were you carrying this?" he asked quietly. Marta swallowed. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Because we were ordered to." "Ordered by who?" She closed her eyes, gathering strength. "By our commanding officer before the airstrike. Our regiment was supposed to relay coordinates for a defensive barrage, but the unit was destroyed. The men were killed or scattered. We never reached the point where the transmission was supposed to be made." Whitford considered her words, weighing truth against danger. "You still could have used this against us." Marta lifted her head for the first time. Emotion broke through her calm exterior. "We could have," she said, "but we did not. We were hungry, cold, falling apart. We had no intention of fighting anyone anymore." One of the auxiliaries collapsed into tears, sobbing that they had begged Marta to destroy the transmitter days earlier. Another cried out that they were terrified to be caught with it by either side, that the satchel felt like a death sentence hanging over them. The sergeant stepped forward. "Lieutenant, this is not good. Command will say they are spies. They will say this was intentional." Whitford looked at the women, all of them too weak to stand upright without leaning on one another. Their fear was real. Their exhaustion was real. Their suffering was unmistakable. He asked Marta again, "Why did you not destroy the codes?" She hesitated, and in that brief pause the entire patrol seemed to hold its breath. Finally she answered, "Because we believed we still had a purpose, even if it was only the idea of one. But when your men gave us food, blankets, kindness, it changed something. It changed me." She looked at the satchel in Whitford's hand. "That meal was The first mercy we saw in months. I could not repay it with harm. The codes no longer meant anything after that. It was a strange confession, too simple and too human to belong in a war that had stripped humanity away from entire nations. The soldiers stared at her, unsure how to reconcile the truth of her voice with the danger of what she carried. Whitford closed the satchel. "We take it with us," he said finally. "No blame. No decisions here. Command can handle the rest." Relief washed over several of the auxiliaries. Marta exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders for the first time in days. The patrol resumed the march. They walked for another 2 hours through deep snow, the transmitter now secured in Whitford's pack. The woods grew darker as clouds thickened overhead. A distant barrage echoed through the valley, reminding everyone that the front was still alive and shifting. Yet something had changed among the group. The fear had not vanished, but it had softened. The women walked closer to the Americans, now not with trust, but with the first fragile steps of acceptance. The soldiers watched the auxiliaries with a more complex awareness, one shaped by the mix of danger uncovered and mercy already given. As they neared the American lines, the hum of generators and the faint glow of lamps appeared through the trees. The holding site was close. Medical tents stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. Trucks idled near the perimeter. MPs waited at the gate. The women stepped forward slowly, some weeping softly as the first real sign of safety came into view. Marta lingered at the rear, her eyes drifting back toward the valley as if still haunted by past she had not fully left behind. No one knew what would happen next. No one knew how command would judge them. No one knew whether the codes Marta carried would be remembered as a threat or as a relic of a duty abandoned too late. War never gave simple answers. It only offered choices and consequences. The patrol escorted the auxiliaries into the camp. Doctors approached. Blankets were offered. Food was distributed again, though gently, measured carefully for starving bodies. Whitford glanced back toward the woods one last time. Snow continued falling. Somewhere out there lay the shattered remains of the regiment that had sent these women into the forest with orders they would never fulfill. Somewhere out there lay the unfinished story of men and women who had believed they were fighting for a country that had already fallen. The narrator's voice settles softly, and before the story fades into the next chapter of history, one more truth remains. Mercy had changed the course of 32 lives that day, perhaps more than anyone would ever fully understand. And now, before the story ends, please share, like, comment, and subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files. Let us know where you are watching from. Your support allows us to bring more powerful historical stories to life.